Good morning. What is going on? Welcome to Abyss Gazing, a horror podcast where we celebrate all things spooky and mental health. I am your co-host, Josh.
And I'm your co-host, Mark.
And on this episode, we actually are going to be talking about not only indie horror with our guest, but also celebrating the life of Anne Rice.
Yeah, we decided to take on, after recent events and announcements of her death, that we were going to cover Interview with the Vampire.
Which, ironically, in and of itself, just a reminder to viewers/listeners that we are getting a reboot of at the end of this year. I
Yeah, I'm not
don't know
sure
how
how.
I feel about that
Yeah, I don't either.
because I mean, like, well, and we'll get into it, but I mean, like, I feel like this adaptation of Interview works so well because Anne Rice came back to actually write her novel. Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Kirsten-Dunst, like that cast right there, and in also throwing in like Christian-Slater, Antonio Banderas, all of these just kind of feel like they hit at the perfect time to be the perfect storm.
Yeah, because the only real, huge name at the time in that movie was Tom Cruise. The others were Brad Pitt and Antonio Banderas were big names, but they weren't Tom Cruise at the time. So they got good actors and soon to be huge actors, probably at a decent price with a pretty good script and cover of a really good book.
I will also throw this in the fact that like Antonio Banderas he was either a year away or had just done Desperado, which is another episode we covered last year. And Brad Pitt had just done Legend of the Fall, so like they were not the mega stars that we know them as today.
Yeah, and I believe it was Kirsten Dunst's first movie too.
Dude, I have so much to say about Kirsten Dunst in this movie, but let's go ahead before we get too much into this. We're gonna show you guys a trailer for our guests. He is the writer and director of the short film called Threshold. It is one of our contenders for our upcoming film festival, Horrific Hope, which you guys can attend digitally on April 29th and in person at the Alamo in Winchester, Virginia. This is Threshold.
I close my eyes and I disappear. A calmness in the dark. I open up and the world is new. Alone with only thoughts. So step outside of your comfort zone and into comforting arms.
Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Mr. Mike Thompson.
Hey guys, what's going on? I'm trying to figure out this camera angle here. I'm like sliding the opposite way. How are you guys doing?
We're
Doing
good, man.
good.
How are you?
I'm doing all right.
I just want to say that, like, I don't know if Mark is also one of the programmers for the festival. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to watch it yet, Mark.
I have not.
So I guess most of my questions are going to be coming from myself. I really enjoyed this film. I thought that it's such an elegant, simple premise, but it's really effective. And I'm kind of wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about Threshold, for the listeners of the podcast that might have not gotten a chance to see the trailer for it.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, by the way, for the compliments on the film. My co-writer Joe Stockton and I had started kind of becoming like COVID pen pal buddies, basically, like just having these phone calls and decided to start writing together. and really wanted to make another short, and realized we were going to have to do something, like you said, very stripped down because of COVID. And it was like, okay, let's kind of take baby steps to get back into this and figure out a way that we can have sort of minimal crew, minimal talent and stuff like that. So, because we filmed it in March, so it was before like the heavier vaccine rollout. And so we were still kind of like navigating that space. But so we went back and looked and said, well, why don't we do something that's primarily one character that's maybe like a home invasion thing or something. We went back and kind of drew a lot of influence from like old Hitchcock movies like Rear Window, but we also went back to things like Repulsion or Wait Until Dark. And then also kind of looked at things like Panic Room or The Strangers, and tried to make it part Hitchcockian thriller, like psychological thing, but also add some of the elements of what modern indie horror would have. The film itself is kind of takes a cue from a very classic like horror concept of like the person that's alone in their house but debilitated in a way that if something goes down that they can't escape it. In Rear Window, Jimmy Stewart had a broken leg, and Wait Until Dark, Audrey Hepburn's blind, and so we were like, well, it'd be kind of cool to maybe do something because of how COVID has affected everybody's mental health, that if we make something that has to do with that, that maybe it might resonate with people a little bit more. And so we kind of just, I think in 2 or 3 drafts, just threw down this concept. But the main basic idea of the film is a woman who's agoraphobic, and possibly bipolar. We don't like dive into it. We just give you hints at things after we did a bunch of research to make sure that it tracked. But she's a voiceover actress who's agoraphobic, and she begins to think that somebody's in her house or somebody's messing with her. And as things start to go on, you start to kind of question whether or not it's really happening to her or not, or if it's something she's imagining. And so, yeah, it was a ton of fun because we got to kind of play with all these different tropes that were in ghost house movies, like haunted house movies or thrillers or home invasion things, or even just kind of like old film noir type stuff. Yeah, it was like a lot of fun to film.
This movie gave me like goals as a podcaster to be like, I could never leave my house again. Like, granted, like I don't want to be a agoraphobe, but like also at the same time, like if I could just get paid to like stand behind a microphone, I'd be set for the rest of my life. Which is
that's what
I'm working towards.
Yeah, I mean, that's what was kind of a trip about it. Was originally she wasn't going to be a voiceover actress. We kept like trying to figure out things that she could do from home, and it was just kind of getting boring because we were like, oh, man, if you make her a writer, it's just like these other 12 movies. If you make her this, then it's too many other things. She has to have some kind of income. And so when we started writing it, a buddy of mine who owns the apartment that we shot in, he was like, well, just come over to my apartment and see if like it would work. And it did because of the geography. But when we walked in, because you can't really tell there's not a lot of wides because it was a small space, but it has like 2 figure 8s in it. So it's like every little room has 2 other doors coming out of it or something. It's like a really strange old apartment. But he himself is an actor, and during COVID was getting all these voiceover gigs, and he had built that booth for himself. And he was like, oh, just close that door off. And I was like, well, can we use that? And he said, yeah. Why? And I said, I just have this idea. And I ran back to the house and called my writing partner, Joe. And I was like, dude, that's what it is. She's like a voiceover actress. And then because Joe is a sound designer, like most recently, he did the sound for that movie, The Dark and the Wicked. Nice. Yeah. He just did that. And he's very good at that, like in terms of like picking up sound design and ambient sound that makes things kind of scary. And so he started writing ideas that he had that he knew he could pull off into the script once we knew that we were dealing with like the concept of kind of audio and all the weird things that can happen with it. So
yeah, Dark and the Wicked, I saw that earlier this year. That was nice to say the least.
Yeah. That's a tough movie, man. We It's super dark and, well, pun intended, I guess. But yeah, it was kind of funny because he hit me up and said, I've got this new movie coming out on Shudder that I worked on. You should check it out. And it's, the guy that did The Strangers. And I texted him and I just said, dude, I just felt like Hereditary on a farm. Like, it was just so bleak and but really good. Yeah.
Talking about talking about the isolation and everything going on. I had some friends. We were all talking. We used to work in an office together in tech support and stuff like that. And now we're all working remotely. And we got to joking. Everybody forgot about that movie from the '90s with Sandra Bullock, The Net. That was whole basis of the movie. She was a remote tech person and nobody had ever seen her, and she had to prove she was still real and all kinds of crap. And we're all like, dude, that would suck if that happened today.
Right.
We all work remote. So
I forgot.
You're one step closer now, Mark.
Yeah. Everybody forgot about that movie, especially with what's going on now and so many positions moving to remote. So,
yeah.
Well, I don't want to give away too much about this movie. If you guys want to check it out, keep your eye out on the official lineup, which is going to be released within about a month of from this recording of when we're going to be releasing the lineup of all the films that are finalists into our film festival, Horrific Hope. You guys can find more information and even submit your own film. Links are in the descriptions below. But let's talk about Anne Rice, because I feel like that was kind of what this episode was birthed out of. I'm probably going to be, every once in a while, I love horror, but every once in a while there are elements of the genre that come up that this is definitely a Mark episode. I just want to throw that out there.
Oh, it's a Mark episode. Oh,
bro, I just like vampires and zombies both are like the two genres that it really takes me. It has to be something special for me to connect with the film, just because those are two subgenres that I feel like have been well overdone. And so Anne Rice was never, while I understand she was an important and monumental figure in the grand scheme of modern day vampires, she's not necessarily like, she didn't have like an impact on me the way that like Wes Craven or like John Carpenter did.
Well, it's probably because she was an author instead of a filmmaker, and they adapted a couple of her works. That's probably why. But when you get in, and the Vampire Chronicles is something interesting to begin with, because the first book is Interview with the Vampire, and it's talking to and interviewing Lestat, or not Lestat, Louis, Brad Pitt's character. But when you get into the rest of the series, it follows Lestat. The rest of the, like, God knows how many books is Lestat oriented. So Interview was the only book and story specifically about Louis, or at least that I can remember.
No, I mean, I think that makes sense. I got, like, my mom got into those books when I was a kid. That's how I ended up seeing this way too early. But that's what's a trip about it, is that, like you said, it's like the first book, it kind of introduces you to the character of Lestat. It's kind of weird. It plays like that movie Sicario, how the whole time you think you're supposed to be looking at like Emily Blunt, and then in the last act they just go, no, let's go watch Benicio del Toro for the rest of the thing, and then the rest of the movie's kind of centered around him and stuff like that. And it's kind of the same thing where we have a change where with Lestat's character that allows it to go off on it. But some of those books are like flashbacks, right? Well, not flashbacks. I guess they're technically they're technically modern because of the context or the time period that they were written in.
You have some of them. I've read a handful, not all of them, but like they're modern for their time period they were written in. So 80s, 90s. But then you have Interview with the Vampire was a bunch of talking about Lestat and how Louis became a vampire because of Lestat and flashbacks and stuff. Then you had the second book was The Vampire Lestat, which was his origin, where he was like a royal of some sort.
Right.
I forgot which country, but he was always very flamboyant, very attention hungry, which is what made him different from and ultimately turns him into what everybody knew from the Queen of the Damned movie, is not good as that movie was. Uh, it's
Yeah,
why he
which is a
was that
bummer.
way.
Yeah, it's a bummer too because the book Queen of the Damned is really interesting. Like the idea of Lestat becoming a rock star,
Yeah.
who is a vampire whose shtick on stage is that he's a vampire,
Yeah.
and nobody gets that it's a joke. But I hate what they did with the movie. It just wasn't interesting. But they put it like in modern times, as they put it in like the early 2000s instead of the 80s, and I thought it could have been really fun to see Lestat as like what he was in the book Queen of the Damned, where he was like a hair metal singer.
Yeah,
and it would have tracked so well. It would have been so cool, but they kind of just.
well,
And I think it's because because Interview with the Vampire as an adaptation is so good. You know what I mean?
yeah, it was an excellent adaptation of the book, and then you had the follow-up Queen of the Damned, which was a combination of parts of Vampire Lestat and Queen of the Damned. It was a combination of two books. But Interview with the Vampire was just, if they had put more in it, they completed the storylines that they had for the movie, and to add anything to it would have added more storylines. It just made it like a 2.5, 3 hour movie.
Yeah.
So, but they put it together well. So,
Yeah.
Which we said at the beginning of the show that like we are getting a series at the end of this year.
which I'm curious
Yeah.
because I really want to see Memnock the Devil put on film.
Yeah.
Basically, Lestat's being hunted by the devil, by Memnock.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah. That's a creepy
my
book.
attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the first series we cover on this show, since we do all horror. We've done all movies up to this point.
Yep, we have. And
with
one
the exception of one musical and one film fest.
Yeah.
So
the musical was great though. Thank you very much.
The musical The Wicker Man is now streaming once again on Shudder. We highly recommend it, along with the great documentary Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched. It is a complete history of folk horror, and it's a long one, but it's a great film.
I just watched that like recently, and that was fantastic because I think that's a very underrated horror genre that doesn't get its place. And so to see somebody compile it and say, like you said, it's long too. It's like it goes for
3 or 4 hours.
Yeah. It's kind of like those. What do they call them?
It's like Never Sleep
docs.
Yeah, like those and Never Sleep Again, Camp Crystal Lake Memories. This is the first time we've gotten like a 4-hour horror doc, but yeah, this one is really well because it doesn't just span the medium of film, but you get to see how it progresses from its origins in books to where it is kind of hit its crescendo with like 70s cinema, and then kind of like how it's still being felt with films like Midsommar today.
Yeah, and a lot of like hidden movies and stuff too. You know, like Kill List had a lot of like folk horror elements to it, and yeah, it's such a cool little genre. And so, sorry, it's funny. I just watched that doc, and so I'm like, yes, please go watch that doc.
Yeah, it was really good. I got to cover it last year for Fantasia Fest, and Shudder this month is just really blooming with a lot of like those folk horror, because they have not only Wicker Man but Blood on Satan's Claw is also streaming, and there's a couple other ones that are from like that 70s boom with Vincent Price as well. But yeah, so I've never actually read an Anne Rice book. I didn't grow up on this movie until my wife and I sat down to watch it probably 2 years ago for the first time. And this movie is good. It's not great. I will show my cards very early. But I've never seen Queen of the Damned, so maybe that's an episode we plan for this year, because it also celebrates 20 years this year.
Queen of the Damned
next month, actually. Next month, yeah.
God, that's
February
crazy.
15th, 2022 will be 20 years.
That's insane.
I didn't realize I was that old. It came
You're
out
welcome.
of the Corn. Oh, what was that festival that they used to do? Was it
Family Values. Yeah,
Yeah, that's what it came out of, which is why the music is the way it is. Jonathan Davis did all the music for it and the voiceover for the singing. Yeah,
it's not good either. It's weird. Like
soundtrack's fantastic.
I don't know, man. Well, it's like the music's fine. It's the fact that I forget who plays Lestat, like Stewart somebody, but like
Townsend
or something. It just like it never looks like that's his voice ever. Like you're just kind of like, yeah, that's not him. Like this is a blatant lip sync, and it just doesn't. His mannerisms with like his band, it just doesn't fit. You're just kind of like, oh, why did they do this?
It was kind of rushed. I believe at the same time they were talking about doing another reboot of Interview with the Vampire with Robert Downey Jr.'s Lestat. I know that was discussed way back when. Yeah. They've been talking and planning, and then it disappears, and then it pops back up again, and then it disappears again. But one of them was having Robert Downey Jr.'s Lestat.
Which is kind of a trip that it's been like considered to be like rebooted so many times, because that's I'm gonna, like you said, show my cards. Like that's one of my favorite movies because I grew up on it, and I also, even as an adult, the many times that I've watched it, it's so well executed. It still holds up because there's no CG or anything. Everything's practical. And it's one of the few movies too that anytime somebody says like Tom Cruise is just an action star or something like that, I'm like, nah, dude, go hang out and watch Interview with the Vampire for a minute.
Yeah.
Like,
or Risky
Brad
Business.
Pitt too. or Risky Business or whatever. But everybody in that film fires on all cylinders, and including like the director Neil Jordan just nails that movie.
And talking about the traditional effects, the ash scene with Claudia and her creation or whatever, her mother. That ash scene was amazing. That's traditional effects.
Yeah, like because that movie's always billed as it's like the saddest vampire story ever made, and it's true. It's just watching Louis lose everything. It's what that whole movie is, and having to go back to Lestat, who doesn't really care for him. It's like a pride thing with him. You know what I mean? That like you're my creation, and like I get to tell you what to do, and you're going to operate the way that I think you should operate. And he has this one glean of like, oh, maybe with Claudia, with Kirsten Dunst's character, that this could be somewhat of a normal life, and then it just kind of goes to hell, and it really is. It's really sad because that whole sequence in that church it's not a church, it's a theater. The whole thing with Antonio Banderas' character is rough because it's like, I was telling somebody the other day when you guys brought this podcast, like doing this episode up, I was like, you know what he's like? He's like Lando Calrissian in that movie where like, Lando like sells them out, does all this shit, and then at the end is like, but I'm going to help you get away.
Well,
and it's like, okay. And same thing with, Antonio Banderas' character is, it's like, a lot of this stuff went down because of the rest of the vampires in that theater company, and then he lets them out, but it's too late, to save Claudia.
So the thing with Lestat, and it's not mentioned in the movies at all, period. They even changed this in Queen of the Damned. Lestat was created by a vampire that basically, when he woke up, he handed him a fire and told him to spread his ashes and then kill himself, and he had to figure out everything on his own. That's how Lestat became a vampire. And then he ran into Marius later. But he learned a lot of his vampire ways from Armand too. But he's very arrogant, very condescending, and sadistic for pleasure, for fun, because he's entertained by it. Armand, on the other hand, is sadistic, but it's to serve his purpose and what he wants, his needs. And that comes across more in the movie, where when you get to a certain age, you lose touch. I need you to stay around. But he's allowed Louis to just murder the whole troop of acting vampires, to just kill them all. and
Which is
put it
yeah.
yeah, and put him in a situation to trigger that event so he can essentially start over with Louis to do what he wants and get back in touch with the modern day, because he's hundreds of years old by the time this movie takes place, by the time the story takes place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's another like great like practical effects sequence like you were talking about, was the whole sequence where Brad Pitt just like lays that entire troupe of actors like to waste. Like he just goes in and like he's like tipping like wine barrels over and burning them out of their coffins. And like that part when, and you know, we were talking about casting, and even the little bit parts in it are fantastic. Like Stephen Ray is is like Armand's assistant. I forget what his name is. He's the one that like Brad Pitt just hits with that scythe and just cuts him diagonally. But you know, it just, to me, that movie always hit differently.
It's not the stereotypical vampire movie by any sense. It's not Twilight. It's not the old kind of grizzled, beastly vampires or anything like that. It's its own thing, as if vampires existed and were just trying to exist.
If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us.
Yeah, it's almost kind of like it's almost like an old Hammer vampire movie more than it is anything, or something like, you know, like The Hunger, like the Tony Scott movie. It's less about the stereotypical Bela Lugosi, like Widow's Peak vampire, and taken from the Bram Stoker story. And it's like, it's kind of like, you know how like when you watch like the Dark Knight trilogy, you're like, well, maybe Batman could be a thing. You know what I mean? Like that makes sense, you know? And Interview with the Vampire to me was so realistic in its portrayal, because they are people, you know what I mean? And it's like you said, it's like watching Louis go throughout these centuries of trying to cope with this thing that he didn't really have a desire to be a part of, and watching everything around him die. It's kind of like it touches on, you know, making the vampire character more understanding their human side of it, as opposed to just them as the bad guy and the predator. Like it makes an anti-hero out of Brad Pitt's character, because he's your protagonist, whether you like it or not, you know, kind of thing.
I think that's what really helps this film from someone that doesn't really like vampire movies. I think everything you guys are talking about, this movie, it feels different. Like there's a natural evolution to all of this, and I think when you go throughout the film, like you're starting off with Brad Pitt and Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise's character, which this film is both an anomaly on both of their filmographies, because, you know, I would love to see either actor do something like this again, but also at the same time, like it never quite feels like a vampire movie the way that we know. Like, I think you hit the nail when you're talking about, like, this kind of almost feels like the equivalent of, like, The Dark Knight or, like, horror, Hammer horror, because, like, there's such a grounded nature to it that you get to actually see how these people cope with the fact that Lestat and has made them both vampires. And I think that's what makes the relationship between Kirsten Dunst and Brad Pitt so endearing to me as a viewer, is the fact that both of them have this commonality where Brad Pitt got kind of essentially tricked into becoming a vampire, and then you have Kirsten Dunst, who is a scene stealer in this movie.
Yeah.
And she's kind of like stuck in this little girl body, which I don't know if you guys have kind of seen the Eternals, but like after watching this movie, there's a character that is permanently stuck being I think it's like a 15-year-old for the rest of their lives. And they get to see all of their friends around them grow and have relationships and be adults and do adult things. And I think this film explores that angle really well, where you kind of see where she's not really a doll. She really wants to be respected because she's essentially a 40-year-old stuck in a 10-year-old body.
Right.
Yeah, and they even, with her character, she's almost, after she becomes a vampire, she's like everything Lestat wanted to be, even though he was kind of creating her for Louis. And she is every bit, if not more so, as sadistic and manipulative as he is.
Which,
oh, for sure. The only difference is that, like, she had Brad Pitt, like, in her formidable years to, like, calm her down and tell her what made sense and how to be, versus what he had, which was Lestat. Like, even the fact that, like, Brad Pitt makes Claudia, you know what I mean, to begin with, that bites her and sets her on the path for Lestat to turn her, is like, and that's interesting because it's like, that's what to me plays a lot of the rest of that film, is sort of how Brad Pitt treats her, because it's like guilt, you know what I mean? Because he did it,
that whole scene kind of plays out in a manner that shows you how little respect Lestat had for life, because they're in a was it a Black Plague
France, I think,
section?
right?
Yeah, something like that.
Paris, yeah.
And it was an area of the town that was pretty much blocked off, nailed up, and it was all Black Plague ridden. Everybody was dying of the plague, and they go in there, and she's in there with her dead parents, and he picks up her mom's corpse and starts dancing with it and laughing that there's still life in the old girl yet.
Yeah. and then when they walk out, he literally looks at Brad Pitt's like, "What, man? You got to laugh about it," and he just drops her.
Yeah, he just like,
he just lets her go on the ground. And you're like, "Good God, dude!" Like, that part and the other part of that movie that is so gnarly in terms of like Lestat just being just a horrible, evil being, is when it's Louis and him, and they're in, I think they're still in New Orleans at this point, and they've got like two girls over.
Oh, the brothel.
Yeah, the brothel, and he flips that table off and bites the girl, but then throws her in the coffin and covers her up, and then opens it, and she's like screaming that it's a coffin. He's like, "Well, it's a coffin, then you must be dead. Like, surely you're dead," and all these other things. And he's like going through it, and like, you can see like Brad Pitt's face that he's just like, "What is wrong with you?" You know what I mean? Like, this is, and that's why that movie hits, is that like dichotomy of those two characters. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you have one that's still trying to be human, and one that thinks he's superior, can do what he wants.
Right. Yeah. It's just, I don't know. I think a lot of it, like, that's interesting is like, I saw that, like I was saying earlier, as a kid. My mom was a huge fan of that book when it came out. My mom's kind of the reason I know a lot of horror. My dad's not a big fan of it, but she had read that book, and our neighbor had read that book, and she knew that like I was interested in it because of the trailer, because I just, even as a 10-year-old, like I really loved horror movies and just movies in general. And so she was like, well, I'm going to go see it with her first. And if it's kind of okay to see, then you can go see it. And I went and saw that like in the theater when it was, if it's 95, right? Like
94.
Like
94.
Is it 94? So yeah, I was definitely like 10 years old. But it's weird because back then you don't understand why a movie feels different or what's different about, like, why is, Interview with the Vampire different from watching like Lost Boys or something like that, and in a lot of it as an adult, the more that I've watched it has been just like the tone of it. It's just very dark and very bleak, and it matches something more like, like Let the Right One In, or like we were saying, The Hunger, or even I'm trying to think, it's just there's just something to it, and I think it's the performances too, like if it had been, that's what I'm worried about them adapting it into a TV show. Is it like if it was a Netflix show or like an HBO thing, then maybe I'm not scared, but it depends on where it goes and who's playing who.
I think it's Amazon, isn't it?
It is not Amazon. It's actually AMC.
Okay.
So if it does end up going to AMC, chances are it'll probably go to Shudder, as well. But so like AMC shows have been like real hit or miss. Like the first season, and Mark and I have talked about this off air. Like the first season to Joe Hill's Nosferatu adaptation was really solid. Second season just kind of fell at the wayside. Walking Dead has had its ebbs and flows, and then
Walking Dead has done a good job of adapting the comics to TV.
Okay.
So with that in mind, I mean, it gives a little hope. AMC and Sundance did a Discovery of Witches, which hasn't been too bad. My wife's read the books, and she's really enjoyed the show, and it's not too girly and for my taste. So, but
I wonder.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, guys.
Yeah, I'm wondering how they're going to do it to make it suitable if they're going to release it on TV, but make it well enough for the hordes of fans of the Vampire
Well, so
Chronicles.
that's the thing about this particular movie, is that it's not like overly like gory or bloody. Like I think that's why, like, we keep talking about like why it feels different than like most vampire movies, is that like most vampire movies kind of almost feel like a slasher equivalent in the way that they are bringing on like blood and like death sequences, whereas this is definitely a mental health journey and a character's journey for Brad Pitt's character as he's kind of reciting this story to Christian-Slater. And I feel like, but again, like the thing that we keep bringing on, and we've talked about this, I talked about this more recently with Celeste when we did our top 10 worst movies of last year, is that there are certain moments that happened in the 90s and in like the early 2000s that for pop culture, it just those movies where it was just right place, right time. It was literally lightning in a bottle. And I feel like that is the reason why this movie has endured so long, is that it is right place, right time. You talk about the costume, the production design on this is immaculate. The performances from Tom Cruise, Antonio Banderas, Brad Pitt, Kirsten Dunst. We've brought up the fact that this is Anne Rice actually writing her own material. Like all of that works real well.
I had forgotten about
because
that,
of that.
she was the screenwriter. Like, and it makes sense why it's so well. It's kind of like, if you think about, like, not in the same genre at all, but I don't know if you guys watched Gone Girl, but like Gillian Flynn, she wrote that screenplay. She wrote a screenplay from her own novel, and it was the first one that she had gotten to do that. And you watch that movie and you go, well, yeah, like, you know what I mean? Like, clearly the person handling the adaptation knew what they were doing. And it's like, I think a lot of it too has to do with like director choice. I think now, like, the interest is to typecast people and to say, well, we're doing like a whole remake of Interview with Vampire. We're going to hire all of these horror directors to do it. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, because there's horror directors, modern horror directors like Ari Aster, like Scott Derrickson, that can touch on all those points. But if you hire a bunch of random horror directors, they might have more of an interest in gore or something like that, or treating a vampire as such. But then with the Interview with the Vampire, this is in 1994, and they got Neil Jordan, who had made The Crying Game, to make a vampire movie. And everybody was probably like, I don't think, back then anybody batted an eyelash at it. I think now, like, film Twitter would have lost their minds. They're like, you got the dude to make The Crying Game, and you're like, but bro, that's why that's so good, is it was a person who really much so viewed the vampirism aspect of it as like symbolism more than anything. It wasn't about the vampire aspect, and he made it more about the sad aspects and the dramatic portions of it, and like you said, the mental health of Louis. And the whole session with like Christian-Slater is like therapy. It's the first time he's been allowed to like tell anybody this in a manner that he's able to just unload, and because this reporter wants this story, you know what I mean? And I hope that they kind of do some stuff like that. I was reading a thing, about David Fincher's Mindhunter, about how when they picked the directors for that show, they didn't pick directors that had done police procedurals before, or had, been a director on True Detective or something like that. Like he said, there's documentary directors, there's people like Andrew Dominic, who made, Assassination of Jesse James, and I think there's something to choosing people that are competent directors that have a familiarity with the genre, but are also capable of like this wide array of work, versus somebody who has just like, they made a vampire short one time and then everybody was like, well, just put them in there, like it'll be okay. And I think that's where that's my fear, is like losing it to, like we were joking about Twilight, but is losing it in a way that somebody tries to adapt it more to, like a Riverdale audience or something like that, instead of which I think Riverdale's such an awesome idea and stuff like that, but Interview with the Vampire is not dark Archie, you know what I mean? So it's like, I think that's what happens a lot with shows now, is like you said about AMC, is like their newer stuff I'm not as familiar with, but like older, stuff, not necessarily horror things, but like Mad Men was fantastic. I really liked Halt and Catch Fire.
Breaking Bad,
obviously I'm missing a huge one there. But it's like, I don't know. We'll see. I mean, I hope they do a good job with it, because like you said, Mark, like if they put Memnock the Devil like as a season, it'd be incredible. It'd be one of the scariest things ever. Like,
that was you're not a big reader, are you, Josh?
No, not for real. Like,
get you the book
picky.
on tape. Get you the book on tape at the very least of Memnock the Devil. You don't have to know the background.
Yeah,
I read it before, after pretty much just watching the movies. And it still makes sense. It gives you enough of an insight into Lestat that it makes sense. But the Devil is fantastic.
Yeah, it is. I've read that whole book series like in high school, and it's fantastic. But in terms of quality wise, like matching Interview with the Vampire, like Memnock the Devil is definitely the one that hits. Because the other ones are good. They're great stories. I really like, is the second one just called The Vampire Lestat?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Like that one's great.
And then Queen of the Damned, I think Memnock the Devil was after Queen of the Damned.
Yeah, because it's at one point, Memnock was the last book in the series, and then she wrote another one or two.
Yeah.
Because I think there's like 6 or 7 or something like that. It's crazy.
There's more than
Is there more than that? Oh my God.
Yes.
I remember being a kid and just like seeing that movie, and then going with my mom to the bookstore, because I was like, my mom was a big reader, so she was always like, yeah, you can watch all these movies and stuff, but if there's a book about it, you're going to read it, And so she bought me like a paperback of Interview, and in the back it said, read the rest of the Vampire Chronicles. And at that point there was only
Well,
I think there's only 5 or something at that time, but that's also in like 1996.
I mean, a quick search right now says there's 13.
Holy jeez.
There's
Oh my God.
there's one of the more recent ones is Prince Lestat.
Okay.
She did a couple more over the last couple of years. She stopped for a while and did some very loosely based don't want to call them Christian books, but almost Jesus books, but they were
Oh,
kind
really?
of fiction too. Yeah, she did a couple of them, like 3 or 4. And then she went back to the Vampire Chronicles. She's also done a series of witch books that take place in the same kind of series. She wrote under the name of Anne Rampling. She did a series of they were almost like fantasy erotica, the Beauty series. And then she had some side stories too, like I think Vetero the Vampire and the Violin and stuff were some of those. So
didn't she have a mummy book? Like, isn't Ramses the Damned like a mummy book? Like,
she did a mummy book. I'm trying to think. She had a couple of them, but primarily, I think she did pretty much just horror. And the way it was written, it was more of all of them were essentially more like they were almost everyday people trying to survive, which was translated just so well in Interview with the Vampire.
Yeah.
And then it
definitely
like,
agree.
But like, oh, man, some of the stuff in Interview too, like the little glimpses of vampirism that they give you. Like they don't do these, like you said, Josh, they don't do these big gory set pieces, but man, that first scene when they're starting to record and Brad Pitt's looking out the window and you can tell Christian-Slater's like giving him shit that he's like, okay, like, and then in the middle, like, because he says, like, he's like, so what is it? You think you're a vampire or something? Like, he's real shitty about it because it's fair. But the fact that like, he whips across that room and it just cuts to, and it's not anything crazy. It's not this gnarly, like blurred effect that looks like the Flash or something. It's literally Brad Pitt. It's just a shot of him. And then it cuts to his hand cutting the light on and it pans up to him and he's just sitting there and Christian-Slater just jumps back. And there's something like very sparing about that reaction that it's like, yeah, dude, if I was in a room with somebody and they were telling me that they're a vampire and all of a sudden within a split second they were behind me and had cut the light on, I probably would have freaked the fuck out. You know what I mean? Like, and sorry, I don't know if we're cussing.
No, you're fine. You're fine, dude.
I'm actually pretty proud of myself that it's taken this long for one to figure out. But yeah, I think that's what's so dope about that movie is like how real it feels, man. Like, I love that scene in the theater, like I said, where he's burning the troop of vampires. And when he starts it, all the coffins are on fire and it takes a second, but all of a sudden they start to literally like fly out of the coffins on fire and don't know how to react and stuff. And it's like so scary, it gets super scary in that moment. It's like, that's what I'm saying is like the show has to have that tone, man. It's got to feel bleak and sad and just depressing.
And not just a blood fest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
go ahead.
Sometimes you can have to go back to Mike's point, like it's really going to matter on like the direction of the show. And I think we've seen well-known directors kind of step into unknown territories for them over the years, and it's worked really well. The 2 examples that I'm thinking of right now are Todd Phillips with the Joker, and also Bryce Dallas Howard stepping in to do some of the Mandalorian episodes, and they were terrific. And so I think that you kind of need to have what I would say is like Damon, the way that HBO did the Watchmen series a few years ago, and there's a podcast like accompaniment piece that he did where like Damon Lindelof kind of like they went through like a trilogy of episodes and they would like kind of talk about the creative process and the challenges, and like one of the things that he ended up talking about was like how like the writers and like the directors would like sit in a room and they would all be on the same page with what each episode, every sequence had to be. And I feel like for Interview of the Vampire to live up to its 94 cinematic counterpart, you're going to need that same exact energy and that same exact planning of meticulous storytelling.
No, I mean, you're going to have a showrunner like Lindelof that was on The Watchmen, like somebody that loved The Watchmen to a way that he knew how to make a series for HBO. And I hope whoever, I haven't like seen anything about this. Is it just Interview with the Vampire, or is it like doing the whole Vampire Chronicles?
A second, let's find out.
I think,
but it's like you have to have somebody that fell in love with that. Like if you think about recent like remakes or reboots that were successful, you have to look at like the pedigree of the person that, you know, like Ghostbusters Afterlife, it was Ivan Reitman's son did it. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, that's somebody that cared about it. You know, I think it's Gareth Edwards that did Rogue One. And if you go listen to him talk about Star Wars, you're like, yeah, that dude clearly loves Star Wars way more than some of the other people they've pulled in for it did. And there's something, I just feel like if you're excited and passionate about something, that it shows. That's what was funny when we were talking about different episodes, because I think you guys were talking about Bring Me On for like the Matrix sequels or something. And I was like, dude, I don't even remember 2 and 3. And I was like, and I don't know if I'm going to be the best to talk about it. And then you interviewed me about like Anne Rice-novelist Vampire. And I was like, that's my speed. Let's do that. You know?
So a couple of details. We have a newcomer, Callie, I think I said that right. Coleman is in the series. Lestat is going to be played by Sam Reed, who I believe is an Australian native. And then Bailey Bass is going to be playing Claudia. There's actually no word on who will be playing the Brad Pitt character, but it's also going to be 8 episodes. And I would imagine that because of how the progression of news has been, a lot of it, like they announced it last summer, and then throughout the subsequent months, like they've been showing and giving us casting. I would imagine it's kind of flow like the way Disney did the Book of Boba Fett, where it's released like within the last week of this year, and then the majority of it's going to take place in 2023.
So Bryce Dallas Howard is working on Book of Boba Fett. She's one of the people for that. Producer Mark Johnson for the Vampire Interview with the Vampire. I did a quick search on it too, because I guess that's what we're doing now. Producer Mark Johnson, who also worked on Breaking Bad.
Oh, okay.
And Halt and Catch Fire.
Okay.
So
that
a little bit more faith.
To go off a topic like for 2 seconds, if you guys haven't watched Halt and Catch Fire, that was the best series that AMC put out and most consistent that a lot of people didn't watch, and it was one of my favorite things ever.
So I think whoever's taken up the role of Lestat, though, has some big shoes to fill. I think that's going to be a role that can make or break somebody.
They all do. Like every single one of them. Like
True.
If you think about Brad Pitt's very subdued, and it wasn't the thing for 90s Brad Pitt to be subdued like that. You know, if you think about like Seven, how loud he is and obnoxious he is in Seven and stuff. No, I do too. But if you think about how different that character is, and you see how Brad Pitt could really be, especially back then in the 90s with things like Seven or 12 Monkeys or something. And then you see him in that movie, and it's such a classical, like old school performance. And it's really subtle. And like Josh said about Kirsten Dunst, Jesus, like who wants to go after that? Like that, dude. Oh man, that scene when she's cutting her own hair off. Make her point, and it sounds like a grown, like in the grown woman, like she sounds like a grown woman yelling about like being trapped as this, because I think she's supposed to be like 13 or something, you know, and she like cuts her own hair off, and then it grows back, and like she cuts Lestat's face and his seal back up and stuff, and it's like those little little glimpses into like what they are, because like you said, the rest of it's not about it. There's a lot of very dynamic storytelling through those performances and some of the lighting and stuff like that in that first one that I'm just like, please don't cheap out on it. Like let's let it be what it needs to be, because it's also a period piece. It's a series that takes place in like the 1700s and then goes throughout multiple decades, and centuries and stuff. So
it goes through, I think, before like the Revolutionary War and stuff. I think
because they're like plantation, like that's what Louis is. He's a plantation owner in New Orleans at the beginning, or in Louisiana somewhere. And and then they escaped to Europe when they think they killed the stat. I know that's maybe a spoiler, but it's from 1994. So
if you
we've already spoiled a lot of it. So.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But the way the whole thing plays out, you've got Christian-Slater interviewing Brad Pitt. And at first he's like, whatever. Okay, sure, you're a vampire. Then, oh shit, you're a vampire. Yeah. Then it just turns into pure curiosity from there for him, not realizing that the way it plays out, he was set up.
Yeah. Dude, that whole... I remember, like, man, to geek out about the movie theater experience, but I remember that's one thing I love about, I miss about the theater being the main point of where you see everything, and also the trailers being very sparing and how you could access them and stuff, because I knew nothing about that book or anything. I just knew that, like, Tom Cruise was playing a vampire, and it was like this cool looking vampire movie that I really wanted to see. And then in the theater, man, when like he goes, when Brad Pitt like threatens Christian-Slater at the end and he runs out and he's driving and Lestat pops up in the back of the car, dude, you're just like, what the fuck? You know what I mean? You're just like, oh my God. And he looks so like just terrible from like, what did he say he was doing? He had been surviving in the swamps, like eating alligators and stuff like that. And was like, so he's like technically malnourished because he doesn't have like good blood or something. You know what I mean? And he's just so like scary looking, and he gets in the car and he's driving it and everything, and his shirt's dirty and stuff. And it's just like, that part's terrifying. And it's playing
Symphony of the Devil.
By the Rolling Stones. Or no, it's a Guns N' Roses cover of it. But it's hysterical. You're like, oh my God, dude. And he's repeating all of his lines that he said to Louis at the beginning of the movie and everything. You're just like, man, what a fantastic movie, you know?
How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today.
Well, all right. So like the last like little bit of this, I think that, you know, we would be reminisced if we didn't actually end up talking about some of the mental health themes this movie has.
Sure.
Because it has so many freaking journeys. I think the front half of like Brad Pitt's character, like kind of coming to cope with the fact that like he's now a vampire and that he's gonna be immortal is a fantastic angle. Kirsten-Dunst kind of also coming to terms with the fact that, you know, she's now immortal and kind of like living throughout these centuries, but being stuck as a child, as we've kind of talked about, is also important. But there are a couple like lines that are spoken that I want to like pull out particularly, and there's a line that Lestat actually says to Brad Pitt's character says, you resist the very thing that brings you peace. And I think that sometimes when you're looking at something like depression or anxiety, you can resist talking about it, or just actually end up finding, you know, completion or a cure, because we have this way of just kind of stigmatizing the very thing, and we end up not being able to find peace in it because of it. So we'd rather suffer in silence for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's that with like Brad Pitt's character. Kirsten Dunst has also a weird thing of kind of like that, how you feel as like an adolescent when you don't feel like anybody's listening to you and you're going to be sort of stuck in this form for all of your life. Because when you're 15 or 16, yes, you're still by law like an adult, but that's, or you're a child, but you're an adult though, and you're restrained from kind of how you feel and think because people view you as a child and will always view you as a child until, I don't know. I mean, it's even, I'm like 37 and I still have times people are like, I can't believe, like, I remember you when you were a kid. And it's that sort of perpetual thing of like people constantly treating you like that. And even though you feel different inside. And the thing like Mark talked about with Lestat, that's not necessarily in the movie, but you know, with Lestat, his whole trauma is sort of like abuse and like abandoned parentage and stuff like that. And so his acting out is very based on trauma, and like he decides, you know, he's like a normal person that like some people have their dads take off on them and they kind of just go, whatever, man, move on, deal with it. And then some people go down this path and choose to do those things. And Lestat is like very much so like the portrait of like self-destruction. You know what I mean? It's like, he's self-destructive, but he also like is manipulative, man. You know, like he's like, well, Louis is going to take off, but I'll like make him change this little girl, and kind of like the idea of like a couple splitting up and wanting to have a kid to save a marriage or something, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's, yeah, there's a lot of that stuff, man, like theme wise in that.
I think you bringing up like Lestat in particular, of kind of, you know, to Mark's point about in the book, you have this character that underwent this trauma. And so his cinematic counterpart is also being very manipulative. And it's that terrifying thing is that like we have to know about the history in order to avoid like repeating it.
Yeah.
And so like if trauma is left unresolved, it's almost like a biological, you know, tick that we are going to end up recreating it almost.
For sure.
And that's the really sad part about like, and the really difficult part about like finding peace and finding healing is that you have to go through the old wounds and you have to be willing to put the salt in them.
Well, in an interview with the vampire, Lestat actually finally asked Louis for help.
Yeah.
Close to the end of the movie, they're talking about the 80s, and he finds him in an old cemetery in Louisiana, just kind of living off rats and whatever he can get a hold of. And he actually asked Louis for help coming back out into the light, basically, to get out of where he's stuck.
Which is funny because it's back to he's now doing the things that he once ridiculed Louis for. You know, he'd be like, you just want to hang out like in the crypt and eat on rats, like be my guest, but like that's not a way to live. And then because of like his self-destructive tendencies and him just everything that he does towards the end of the film, he just ends up in a crypt eating rats. And it's
essentially
like
being Louis in the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's strange. Like it's a strange relationship they had that plays on the idea of. I mean, it plays on domestic abuse, like how when people talk about how like abuse victims go back to their abusers, and you're like, with everything you've seen in that movie with Louis and Lestat, you're like, let him die, dude. You know what I mean? Like, why? Who cares? Why are you so interested in helping him and like getting him back out there? Like you should have spit in his face and let him feed on rats for the rest of his life, you know? And it's strange to see him choose to go back to that.
I think it's more telling of Brad Pitt's character, Louis, then
Yeah.
Lestat's at a point of weakness, and Louis now in the position of power and the role model. That and I think he may see it more as a way to almost redeem him than anything
Yeah.
else, to bring him
Yeah.
back.
Like
'Cause
he thinks he can help him. Yeah.
Yeah, he's reached that low that Brad Pitt was at a vampire when he was just eating rats and poodles and stuff.
Yeah.
They go to some sort of rich party. I think it was in Louisiana, and they lure the house the lady that ran everything and like her maid out into a field, and Lestat kills the servant, and he kills the poodles.
The poodles.
Yeah.
And then Lestat just runs up and like turns her head around.
Snaps her neck.
Brutality.
Yeah.
God, yeah.
And it's almost like Lestat at that point is almost gaining a sense of humanity back, where he was just an egotistical, narcissistic monster. But then you see the way he treats Christian-Slater at the end, and it's like, has he really changed, or is it Louis has kind of come around to being what he is?
Well, I think,
yeah, he just is like kind of. It's a play on. I think it's a play on the idea of like their humanity, right? That like Lestat is just a manipulative asshole, and he's going to do whatever he wants and needs to do to get it. And Louis, regardless of what's happened to him, was like, oh, I can't just let him go through this again. And you're just like, you can though. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of. It reminds me of this thing. Like I was. Speaking of like mental health stuff, I had like a really bad period with anxiety last year, and I was in group therapy, and one of the things they brought up was, they said that your abusers, while they should apologize to you and talk to you and stuff like that, and it might be helpful to address them, is that sometimes it's better just to stay away from them because they might not give you the response that you want. Or that you think that they should give. And I think that's kind of like Lestat is like, he was like, well, I'll help him and he'll be back to normal. And then you're like, well, he is back to normal. It's just not good normal.
It's back to Lestat.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, I think what a lot of what you guys are talking on, like kind of proves the point that Mike was originally talking about, is that like, or that we were originally talking about, is that, if you don't resolve it, you are doomed to repeat the past. And so, Louis, by the end of the film, that we have that final confrontation between him and Lestat in the crypt, it's okay. Like Louis has kind of, been warned, and he is kind of come to peace with who he is and like what he is. But also at the same time, here you have this guy that was originally on the top of the world and now is like fighting every day for food and to be seen. And so you kind of have to take you really kind of have to feel your faults. But to Mark's point, I think that again, we're getting to kind of see him manipulate the system, so you're not actually seeing him change at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's doing what he does best. He said what he needed to say to get the help he needed to come back out. So.
Yeah, and I mean that's kind of what leads all the stuff into like Queen of the Damned too, is that he kind of feels recharged, and in that same neighborhood that that crypt was in and all that stuff, he heard like a band practicing and decides to like take advantage of it, and it's
he was tired of being in the shadows, and now there's a way for him to come out in the public, basically, and
say who he is, but also not say who he is because nobody believes him. It's a gimmick,
they think it's just a gimmick, and it's what makes it interesting is that's kind of what he did in the Vampire Lestat. He joined a acting troupe after becoming a vampire, and he was an actor for a long time, so it plays to his character from the book standpoint very well for him to turn around and join an 80s hair metal band in the books, or new metal band in the movie.
Yeah.
Which, in all honesty, like is pure genius. Like I
Yeah.
said, like it
Oh,
takes
yeah.
a lot for me to like really like want to dive into these. And I think there was a comic series that came out years ago called iZombie, which they eventually made into a series. But like
That was a fun
that was such a
series.
it was it was such an interesting like spin on the zombie genre. And here I think one of my favorite sequences is the play when you first meet the Banderas character, and you have Louis and Claudia watching it, and he's just like points out, he's like, it's vampires pretending to be humans pretending to be vampires. So like
Yeah.
everything you're seeing in front of you, you believe to be this like giant theatrical production, when in reality, like you're actually witnessing the sacrifice of a woman.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's genius, but also terrifying in the same sense.
Oh, it's super brutal, man. That overhead shot when they like Antonio Banderas like hands her off, and they just kind of, it's an overhead and they just close in on her, like, and it's
it's
rough.
like a pack of wolves coming in on an animal. Yeah.
Well, and then they show like reaction shots of the audience, and the humans are like, oh my god, like I don't know what I'm watching, you know what I mean? And it's rough, like it holds on it for a while, you know what I mean? You're kind of just like, all right, man, like I get it.
It's one of those movies that I saw the news that Anne Rice died, and I messaged Josh about it, and I was like, I think we need to do an interview with the vampire. So he's like, yeah, what time works for you, and this and that. I'm like, dude, you can record it any day of the week. I have watched this movie so many times over the years, I don't even need to watch it again to do this. I do that movie front to back. And he's like, yeah, this is going to be like my second or third time watching it. Like ever.
It's my second time, by the way.
Second.
Because earlier you were saying that it was good but not great, and it brought up a quote. So one of the DPs that I always work with, Tommy, he's also one of my business partners. Anytime I say something that's like contrary to an opinion he has, he just looks at me and goes, "That's cool, man. Everybody's entitled to be wrong."
Bro, I'm fine with that 100%, man. Like I don't know, like I go back, man. You like what you like, and
I think
honestly,
it's a hint of nostalgia. I think a lot of it's like, no, I'm just fucking with you, like, because I don't believe that. That was something I talked about with a friend the other day. I was like, what is this new shit where everybody has to like everything? Like, and if you say I'm not really, wasn't into that, then everybody goes, you're like a pariah. Like everybody's just like, I can't believe you don't watch that. And I'm like, I don't know, it didn't speak to me. I tried, you know what I mean? Or like the subject matter just doesn't hit. But that, you know, like I would never, like, if you had ever told me you hadn't seen a movie, I would convince you to watch it or like show it to you or something. But if you didn't like it, I'd be like, yeah, I get it. I mean, that's fine, because there's 2 million movies I don't like. You know what I mean?
Dude,
yeah, I give
right
Josh,
there.
I give Josh crap all the time because he's like, yeah, I'm this big horror fan. I'm like, oh, great, you've seen this. And he's like, what? And it's like, that's right. You're a recent horror fan over the last few years.
Yeah, so I didn't grow up, as I've said like earlier in our show. I think way back when we did Ghoulies and Wicker Man, is like there are a handful of films that like I just haven't seen. Like horror is like one of those only genres that you can literally find anything.
Yeah.
Like you can play in anything. Like horror is like clay. Like it can be molded to be anything, because fears are so subjective, and you can have things like zombies and vampires and agoraphobes, or you can explore things like racism with Get Out, and you can also do like sexual assaults and so mental health, and like there's so many different things that you can do. But you can also do like comedies and parodies and homages and make it meta, and there's so many different angles that you can twist and turn with it. And I think that's one of the reasons that I really love this genre. But also at the same time, like there's a lot about this genre that like has yet to be explored for me. And I think that I can reach the end of my grave being a horror fan for 50 some years and still never see all the things, weird things that Mark has gotten into over the years.
Yeah, it's I compare horror to like heavy metal, there's like 9 million genres of heavy metal
Right.
compared to the other genres of music. There may be a handful of subgenres, but I don't think there's anything really as complex as metal.
Oh
You
yeah,
go,
I have a buddy, like we both grew up like metalheads and stuff, but like he has this like encyclopedia like knowledge in terms of genres and stuff. And so when he like explains like a band to me, he's like, oh, this one band's called blah blah, and it's like melodic like death metal that has like hardcore influence or something, blah blah. And I'm just like, God almighty, dude, it's just a metal band. Like, can we just do that? You know? But
yeah,
but
well,
I get it, because you know some people need that.
and
be told that.
horror kind of comes across to me as the same way. As you've got God knows how many subgenres of horror,
No,
but
yeah.
you
It's
don't really have
endless.
you don't really
Endless.
have a genre like that other than
Well,
horror.
you even had, well, like it was like I was talking, because we're working on developing like a feature right now, and the producer who produced Threshold and our short before that, Blackbird, she was very like, at first, because of the types of horror movies that have been made in our area, she was very like resistant to the idea of making anything horror. And I was like, Lori, it's a built-in audience. Like the minute it comes out, it's the only genre that has its own streaming service, you know, purely devoted to that, you know. And so, but it's interesting, like you said, there's so many different genres and there's so many different types of horror fans. Like that's why we have that new disagreement of, is a movie horror or not? And it's such a weird thing, you know. Like I had somebody tell me they didn't think Midsummer was horror, and I was like, I'll tell you what, man, I'll blast you with a bunch of psychedelics and put you in a place that like it's sunlight for most of the day, and then people are going to start killing your friends, and you're going to see people murdered and everything, and we'll just talk about how scary that is, like afterward, you know. And it's strange because like back in the day, I guess because like I grew up watching a bunch of old movies and stuff, because of my parents. So like I was used to movies like Rosemary's Baby or Psycho or you know, to go further in, you know, like John Carpenter movies like The Fog and stuff like that. And so those movies, I 100% believe that if those movies were made now, everybody would say, I don't know that this is necessarily a horror movie, but it's got horror elements and like it's this. And it's more of like a suspense movie. And I'm like, what are you like? You know what I mean? It's a trip like that. That's a thing. Yeah. But that's what's so funny about like indie horror in specific is a lot of the stuff that comes out that I'll have friends that are more like slasher oriented or like, you know, that like anytime a Halloween movie comes out, they're like, just give me, you know, just take my money, you know. And and I'll go see something like, I don't remember what the fuck was the movie. Oh, that movie It Comes at Night, the Joel Edgerton movie.
Yep.
And I went and saw it and I loved it. And then that same group of people were like, I didn't think that movie was scary at all. And I was like, once again, it's the end of the world. A disease has killed everybody, and you're in a locked up in a house with your family, and somebody got in. Like, yeah, that's gnarly, dude. Like, and so hopefully, like with the way that indie horror has been, is, you know, like Josh said, that horror focuses on like mental health, and it plays with different ideas, and it uses these things that we know about mental health as tropes to like play into it. It's been doing that since back in the day. Repulsion is literally about a person, you know, a woman losing her mind in her apartment. And it's like so well done and so well crafted, but it gets ignored. It gets the horror button, and it's like instantly trash to some people back then, you know? And then now horror is huge, but like specific horror is huge. It's very strange. And so it's like indie horror is like what's making all the old stuff, you know, like A24 movies always feel like old 70s horror movies, or you know, and same thing with like Neon and some of the IFC midnight stuff like The Vigil and stuff like that were very scary, and I love them because then people will be like, oh, it's slow, and I'm like, yeah, it's a horror movie, dude. It's like you got to let it creep around. You got to let the camera show you weird things. You got to hear noises in the background and whatever else. Like, and so yeah, it's interesting.
And I like how they've been approaching horror on a more traditional effects level recently too.
Yeah,
over the
Yeah.
last few years, everything was just slammed full of CG.
Yeah.
It's part of what ruined the Thing prequel was the studio stepped in and said they wanted
Yeah.
faster, bigger monsters, so we can't do animatronics. You have to use computer, and that's what made the original Thing so creepy was the
Yeah.
animatronic monsters.
Because it
And
looked real.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It still does.
It gives it that timeless effort too.
yeah. And I think that's a good move on the studio's part is to start going, you know what? These guys actually do like their traditional effects, even if they do look cheesy. There's an audience for it, and they love it. And I do like that started to happen recently over the last few years
Yeah.
with horror in general.
Yeah,
I mean, even
have you ever seen those like the videos of the special effects house like with the real practical effects for that Thing prequel?
I have not. No.
So the company that made it, they're called like Amalgamated Dynamics, and it's the guys Tom Tom Woodruff Jr. and Alec Gillis, who were like tutored. They learned from Stan Winston. They were the ones who created the Alien Queen and Aliens, like just amazing practical effects work. And they did all the practical effects for that movie. And then at the last minute, the studio was like, we think we want to go CGI. We think this needs to look different and all this other stuff. And so the Amalgamated Dynamics on their YouTube just threw all of the test footage of the original effects for like the Thing prequel on YouTube. They were like, this is what it could have looked like. And then they made a movie like on Kickstarter called Harbinger Down that was basically like, well, we didn't get to use all of our effects in the Thing, so this movie's literally just going to be like a tribute to like practical monster effects. And it's a lot of fun. But like, you know, man, what sucks too is that Thing prequel had a cool story. And there's a lot about it to like. I think a lot of people just immediately go CGI, fuck it, don't want to watch this. But if you go watch that movie, a lot of the setup with how everybody dies in the Thing prequel, it matches to all the bodies that they find in the Norwegian camp later in the Thing.
Yeah.
And you're just sitting there going, that's genius. You know what I mean? And then it ends with the footage of them chasing the husky. And you're just kind of like, yeah, this is an incredible prequel ruined by just poor timing and bad effects. And like, you know, it's just such a strange, I don't know. It's a weird thing that they do.
Yeah. You've got these fast, super shiny CG monsters in a prequel to a movie that had slower conventional effects that was super creepy. It does. Yeah. But the way they lined it up, everybody, if you watch the end of the original Thing or the beginning where they go to the camp and you see where everybody has died at and how they're sitting or laying, it matches up to how they die in the prequel.
Yeah, you even see how like the double-faced thing that they find in the snow got out there and everything, and it's really incredible. Like it's just a bummer. It's such a you think it wouldn't have been that drastic if they just changed the effects, but it is. Like it is. It makes all of the difference because you have good performances in it. You have Mary Elizabeth Winstead is the lead. You got Joel Edgerton as kind of the MacReady type character, like he flies the helicopter and everything. And, it's such a cool little story, and then it just like you go, oh, that's what the monster looks like. Okay, you know, like
it got derailed by the studios.
Yeah, which is very common.
I've heard that happens a lot in the.
Dude, go watch the extra. I don't know if you guys are like Alien trilogy fans, but go watch the behind the scenes stuff on Alien 3. You just like you sit there and you go, I can't believe that this movie even got finished. Like, how did this get finished? You know, because
I liked Alien 3, so
I did too. That's one of my favorites of that trilogy. That's another movie I saw in the theaters when I was really young. Because my dad would take me to see stuff like that on like matinees. Like he'd be like, "We're gonna go watch." I don't know. I was like 7 when that came out or something. He'd be like, "We're gonna go watch Alien 3. Or we're gonna go watch Terminator 2 in the movie theater or something." And Alien 3, I think, is fantastic. It's got its issues with like effects, but it's also once again because of them rushing the story through and stuff.
Yeah.
But, dude, I'm not even kidding. Go because it's because David Fincher directed that it's even decent. Yeah, I mean, because it looks like a David Fincher movie, it feels like it, but when you listen to like how they, he would shoot for 12 hours, go back to the hotel room, get on a call with Fox, and then get slipped a piece of paper under his door, and they're like, "These are the new script pages for tomorrow. Like they rewrote it. Everything you did today is kind of like null and void." And you're just like, how do you expect? And like to the point that he almost tried to like take his name off of it and stuff because he was like, "I hate this. Like this is trash. Like all this other really interesting." I have like a weird obsessive nature with the whole Alien franchise, and I have this like Blu-ray set that has like 9 hours worth of extras or something. And one day I was just like, I'm just gonna watch all 9 hours of these extras, I guess. And you learn just some crazy stuff, even with James Cameron and Ridley Scott, in that series. But to your point, yeah, like studio interference is such a bad thing now because horror back in the day, nobody gave a shit. Like the studio was like, we're making this little horror movie to like make our money for the year or something. And then it started to become so successful that they're like, well, let's not let them do what they've been doing that's making money. Let's like over scrutinize every single detail and then wonder why it doesn't make its money back because we killed it,
I feel like you can't actually he just magically left. All right. I feel like you can't I'll say this and then we'll go ahead and end. I feel like you can't actually bring up this conversation without bringing up the Weinsteins because boy howdy, when you get into some of the behind the scenes of like Scream, freaking the later Halloween sequels, and also at the same time even the some of the Pinhead sequels, man, like it just it's so brutal. Like they think that they knew it, and it's just like, dude, like I promise you don't think you know what makes these films so successful. But on that note, I think it's time we wrapped up.
Sure.
And just one more time, man, where can people follow you and your film career online?
So you can hit me up on Instagram a lot. It's at Missing Reels, REELS. And then my partners and I do a lot of work at a place called Marquee, and that's marqueelouisville.com or neonbites.com. Those are our two kind of like content houses where we do all of our film work. Those are usually the two best places to check out, and then all the socials kind of lined up from there.
All right, Mark, where can people follow you online?
I'm just a nerd that paints a lot of miniatures and war game junk. I'm Titanium Juggernaut on Titanium Juggernaut painting on Instagram.
All right, well, you guys can follow me. I'm on Letterboxd at Captain Nostalgia, where you can follow my film journey. You guys can follow our parent company, Victims and Villains. We are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, wherever you guys get your podcasts from. Most importantly, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net, where you guys can find links to more content, more bonus content, podcasts like this, all of our social medias, Patreon, but most importantly, also find out more about our mental health resource library. And until next time, remember that the longer you stare into the abyss, the more the abyss gazes back. Have a good night, guys.